They thought I was just another employee they could replace with software and a few spreadsheets. After 21 years, they walked me into a conference room, handed me a folder, and eliminated my position in less than 15 minutes. They believed they were cutting costs. What they didn't realize was that one signature, my signature, kept one of the company's biggest government contracts alive. I didn't threaten anyone. I didn't argue. I simply packed my things, walked out the front door, and let them discover what happens when experience disappears overnight. The email landed in my inbox at 8:12 on a Tuesday morning. Mandatory meeting. Conference room B. 8:30 a.m. No subject line beyond that. No explanation. Just my manager, someone from Human Resources, and the Chief Operating Officer listed as attendees. After 21 years in corporate logistics, I had learned that meetings scheduled without context almost never ended well. My name is Daniel Carter. I'm 53 years old, and until that morning, I had spent more than 2 decades building the operational backbone of one of the largest manufacturing companies in the Midwest. I wasn't a vice president. I wasn't a public face of the company. My picture had never appeared in annual reports or promotional brochures. I was simply the person everyone called whenever something critical stopped working. Factories don't run on motivational speeches or colorful PowerPoint presentations. They run because someone understands every supplier, every warehouse, every transportation route, every contingency plan, and every small decision that keeps thousands of moving parts synchronized. That someone had been me for a very long time. I started at Horizon Industrial as a warehouse coordinator when I was 32. The company had only 3 production facilities back then. We knew everyone's name, celebrated birthdays together, and solved problems with conversations instead of committees. As the business expanded, so did my responsibilities. I helped design inventory systems, negotiated transportation contracts, reorganized distribution centers, and built emergency supply procedures that later became company standards. Whenever a winter storm shut down highways, I knew which rail carriers could still move freight. Whenever a supplier suddenly failed, I already had 3 backup contacts ready. Whenever customers demanded impossible delivery schedules, I somehow made them possible. Nobody noticed when everything worked. They only noticed when it didn't. And because things rarely failed, most executives assumed success happened automatically. About a year before everything changed, Horizon hired a new chief operating officer named Ryan Edwards. He was 34. He had graduated from a prestigious business school, spent a few years consulting for technology startups, and spoke almost exclusively in management buzzwords: optimization, transformation, lean restructuring, digital acceleration. Every meeting sounded like a conference presentation instead of an operational discussion. Ryan believed experience was overrated. According to him, modern software and artificial intelligence could replace decades of institutional knowledge. The future belongs to systems, he liked saying. The company shouldn't depend on individuals. On paper, that sounded reasonable. In reality, someone still had to build those systems. Someone had to understand why certain suppliers couldn't be replaced overnight. Someone had to know why Factory 3 always ordered safety stock 2 weeks earlier than everyone else. Someone had to remember that one transportation company consistently failed during hurricane season despite having the cheapest rates. Those details weren't stored inside software. They lived inside people. People like me. At first, Ryan acted friendly. He invited department heads for coffee, asked about our careers, pretended he wanted to learn. I genuinely believed he was trying to understand the business. Looking back, I realize he was simply identifying which positions looked expensive enough to eliminate. A few months later, consultants began appearing throughout the building. Young analysts carrying laptops instead of clipboards. They timed processes, measured employee activity, created colorful charts, asked questions that had obvious answers. One afternoon, one of them stopped by my office. "So, what exactly do you do every day?" I smiled. "Whatever needs doing." He laughed. "No, seriously. I am serious." He frowned while typing something into his spreadsheet. I could almost see the disappointment. There wasn't a neat category for solving problems nobody else even knew existed. A week later, Ryan invited me into his office. He pointed toward a presentation on the screen. We're redesigning operational management. Looks ambitious, I replied. It'll reduce management overhead by 30%. I studied the organizational chart. My department had disappeared. Its responsibilities had been divided between software automation and 3 regional supervisors. Who's coordinating supplier risk? I asked. The platform. And emergency sourcing? Our procurement software. International customs delays? We'll monitor those through dashboards. I looked at him quietly. You've never managed an actual supply chain, have you? His smile faded. The data says this model works. The data has never negotiated with the dockworkers' strike. He leaned back in his chair. Daniel, sometimes long-term employees resist change because they're emotionally attached to outdated processes. I stood. No, we resist mistakes we've already seen before. That conversation ended politely, but from that day forward I knew my position had a countdown attached to it. 3 weeks later, several experienced managers accepted early retirement packages. 2 department heads quietly resigned. Nobody replaced them. Their responsibilities simply disappeared into new software systems. Employees started asking me if I was worried. I always answered the same way. If the company believes experience has no value, nothing I say will change their mind. Still, I kept working. I updated contingency plans, finished supplier audits, reviewed contracts scheduled for renewal. Most importantly, I completed the annual operational continuity report. It wasn't an exciting document. Almost nobody read it. But it explained every critical dependency inside Horizon's logistics network, including one detail I had warned management about for 4 consecutive years. Our largest government contract required a certified operational compliance manager to approve every quarterly audit. The certification wasn't attached to the company. It belonged to an individual. Replacing that individual required months of external review. Every year I reminded leadership. Every year they acknowledged it. Every year nothing changed. Until Tuesday morning. Conference room B looked exactly the way these rooms always do. Neutral walls. Artificial plants. Coffee nobody wanted. The HR director smiled with practiced sympathy. Ryan sat beside her without making eye contact. We appreciate everything you've contributed over the years. That sentence told me everything before the conversation even started. The restructuring was complete. My position had been eliminated. They called it organizational efficiency. They handed me a folder containing severance documents, insurance information, and instructions for returning company property. 21 years summarized in 15 printed pages. When the HR representative finished reading the prepared statement, she asked if I had any questions. I looked directly at Ryan. Who's taking over operational compliance certification? He answered immediately. The transition has already been planned. By whom? Our implementation team. They certified? A short silence filled the room. Ryan finally responded. We'll manage. That wasn't an answer. It was optimism disguised as competence. I nodded slowly. Then I wish you good luck. He seemed surprised I wasn't angry. The truth was, anger wouldn't change anything. Companies rarely reverse decisions made in executive meetings. I signed the paperwork, turned in my security badge, packed family photographs, a coffee mug, 2 notebooks, and a small brass compass my father had carried while working on cargo ships decades earlier. As I walked through the building for the last time, employees avoided looking directly at me. Some nodded. Others whispered. Nobody knew what to say. Neither did I. Outside, the parking lot was unusually quiet. I placed the box in the back of my pickup truck and looked once more at the building where I had spent nearly half my adult life. I wasn't thinking about revenge. I wasn't planning lawsuits. I wasn't hoping the company would fail. I was simply wondering how long it would take before someone discovered that replacing experience was far more complicated than deleting a position from an organizational chart. The next morning felt strangely quiet. For the first time in more than 2 decades, I woke up without checking overnight shipping reports or scanning emails from overseas suppliers before sunrise. My phone wasn't vibrating every 10 minutes. There were no production alerts, no emergency conference calls, no trucks delayed at border crossings waiting for someone to make a decision. It should have felt relaxing. Instead, it felt unfamiliar. My wife, Emily, poured me a cup of coffee and sat across the kitchen table. "So," she asked carefully, "what's the plan?" I shrugged. "Honestly, I don't know yet." She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "You've solved bigger problems than unemployment." She was right. Over the years we'd survived layoffs, recessions, supply shortages, and even a warehouse fire that nearly shut down one of Horizon's largest facilities. Every crisis had eventually passed. This one would too. Still, I couldn't ignore reality. Our mortgage still had 8 years left. Health insurance would become significantly more expensive. College tuition for our youngest daughter wasn't getting any cheaper. 21 years of stable employment creates a certain confidence that disappears surprisingly fast once the paychecks stop. I opened my laptop and began updating my resume. Before I had finished the second page, my phone rang. Unknown number. I ignored it. A minute later it rang again. Then again. Finally, a voicemail notification appeared. It was Kevin Morris, Horizon's Vice President of Finance. His voice sounded unusually tense. "Daniel, give me a call when you can. We've run into a small issue with some operational documentation. Nothing serious, we just need to clarify a few things." A small issue. I smiled to myself. Companies rarely describe genuine problems honestly, especially when executives are involved. 5 minutes later, another call arrived. This time it was Lisa Grant, one of the logistics supervisors who had worked with me for nearly 12 years. Instead of leaving a voicemail, she sent a text. "Daniel, are you available? Things are getting messy here." I replied. "What happened?" Her answer came almost immediately. "Nobody can access the quarterly compliance approval portal. The government audit team says our certification is incomplete. Ryan says it's probably a software bug." I stared at the screen for several seconds. It wasn't a software bug. It was exactly what I had warned them about. The operational compliance certificate wasn't attached to Horizon Industrial. It was attached to the certified individual responsible for maintaining it. When my employment ended, Horizon automatically lost that certification until another qualified manager completed the federal review process. That process usually took 3 to 5 months, sometimes longer. I typed one sentence. "Check Section 9(4) of the Federal Compliance Agreement." She responded with a confused question mark. I didn't explain further. If management hadn't bothered reading the contract before eliminating my position, they needed to discover the consequences themselves. Around lunchtime, my phone rang again. This time it was Ryan. I considered ignoring the call. Curiosity won. "Hello." There was a brief pause before he spoke. "Daniel, thanks for answering." His confidence from the previous day had softened. "We're having a little trouble accessing some compliance systems." I heard. "We think there may be an authorization conflict." "There is. You know how to fix it?" "I know why it's happening." Another silence. "Would you mind coming in this afternoon? Just for an hour." "I'm no longer an employee." "I understand. Then why would I have access to internal systems?" "We could arrange temporary credentials." I leaned back in my chair. "Ryan, temporary credentials don't replace federal certification." "I think you're making this sound more complicated than it really is." "No. I think you're only now discovering how complicated it always was." He exhaled loudly. "We'll figure something out." "I hope you do." The call ended without either of us saying goodbye. Later that afternoon, Lisa called again. This time she didn't bother hiding her frustration. "It's chaos." "What happened?" "The government auditors rejected the quarterly submission." "I expected that." "Ryan keeps telling everyone the approval will arrive automatically once IT refreshes the system." I couldn't help shaking my head. This had nothing to do with information technology. Federal auditors don't approve certifications because someone restarts a server. "They've called 2 consulting firms already," Lisa continued. "Neither can help." "Because they aren't certified?" "Exactly." She lowered her voice. "And Daniel." "Yes?" "People are starting to realize you weren't just another manager." I thanked her for the update before ending the call. Not because I enjoyed hearing the company struggle. I didn't. Many good people still worked there. People who had spent years helping me solve impossible deadlines. Warehouse crews, dispatch coordinators, engineers, purchasing specialists. They weren't responsible for executive decisions. Unfortunately, they would be the first to suffer the consequences. By Thursday morning, the situation had grown worse. An industry contact called me over breakfast. His company supplied packaging materials to Horizon. I heard they're delaying purchase orders. That's unusual. They're freezing spending until compliance gets sorted out. That was serious. Large manufacturers don't delay supplier payments unless executives become nervous. By noon, another recruiter contacted me through LinkedIn. Then another. Apparently, news traveled quickly within the logistics industry. Experienced operational managers with government compliance backgrounds weren't easy to find, especially ones who had spent 2 decades inside complex manufacturing environments. I politely thanked each recruiter. For the moment, I wasn't interested. Not until I understood exactly where things were heading. Friday afternoon brought an unexpected visitor. A courier delivered an overnight envelope to my house. Inside was a formal letter from Horizon Industrial's legal department. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't an offer to return. It was an invitation to provide short-term consulting services regarding operational transition. The proposed rate caught my attention. $300 per hour. Less than they billed clients for junior consultants. Much less than the value they suddenly needed. I folded the letter carefully, then placed it back inside the envelope. If they wanted professional consulting, we discuss it professionally. But this conversation would happen on equal terms, not because they expected me to rescue decisions they had made without listening. That evening, I opened a blank document on my laptop. At the top of the page, I typed 4 simple words. Carter Operational Advisory LLC. I wasn't sure whether it would become a real business. Maybe it would. Maybe it wouldn't. But after 21 years of solving other people's problems, one thing had become perfectly clear. If companies truly believed experience had value only after it disappeared, then perhaps it was finally time to let that experience work for me instead. The following Monday started with 6 missed calls before 9 o'clock. 3 came from Horizon. 2 were from numbers I didn't recognize. 1 belonged to a consulting firm that specialized in manufacturing compliance. I ignored all of them while finishing breakfast. For 21 years I had answered every phone call within seconds, whether I was at work, on vacation, or sitting in the stands at one of my daughter's softball games. Those days were over. Around 10 o'clock my lawyer, Karen Ellis, called. I'd contacted her the previous Friday after receiving Horizon's consulting proposal. She specialized in employment law and commercial contracts, and unlike most attorneys I'd worked with over the years, she preferred practical advice over dramatic speeches. I reviewed the letter, she said. And they're nervous. I figured. No, she replied. They're more than nervous. They wouldn't involve legal counsel this early, unless the situation was affecting something much larger than internal operations. She paused. I also looked into the government certification requirement. What did you find? You warned them. Several times. In writing. Every year. Keep those emails. That was all she needed to say. By lunchtime, Lisa called again. I've got news. I'm listening. The executive board had an emergency meeting this morning. No surprise there. It lasted nearly 5 hours. And Ryan didn't come back afterward. I stayed quiet. They've put him on administrative leave while the board reviews the restructuring. I wasn't shocked. Corporate executives often receive praise when things appear successful. When those same decisions begin costing millions of dollars, praise disappears remarkably fast. Anything else? I asked. Lisa laughed nervously. The consultants they hired admitted, they can't replace your certification before the next federal review. That's accurate. The production schedule for next quarter is frozen until the compliance issue is resolved. That concerned me far more than Ryan losing his position. Production delays affected hundreds of employees. Factory workers, drivers, maintenance crews, families who had nothing to do with executive mistakes. People are scared, Lisa admitted quietly. They think layoffs are coming. I looked out the kitchen window. I hope it doesn't come to that. I think everyone wishes management had listened. The following morning, I officially registered Carter Operational Advisory LLC. The paperwork took less than an hour. For years, I had helped suppliers launch distribution centers, restructure transportation networks, and improve operational efficiency. Starting my own business suddenly didn't seem impossible. By Wednesday, I had finished building a professional website. Nothing flashy. No exaggerated promises. Just a simple description of what I actually knew how to do. Operational continuity, government compliance, supply chain risk management, crisis planning. Within 24 hours, the website generated its first inquiry. Not from Horizon. From another manufacturing company 2 states away. Their operations director had heard I was available through an industry contact. They wanted someone to review emergency sourcing procedures. The project lasted only 3 days. But when I submitted the final report, the company thanked me for identifying several vulnerabilities that could have interrupted production during severe weather. For the first time in years, someone valued my experience before disaster struck. That felt different. Friday afternoon, Karen called again. They've sent another offer. I opened the email while she spoke. The consulting rate had increased dramatically. $1,000 per hour. Minimum 40-hour engagement. Travel expenses included. It was a much better proposal. Still, something was missing. What do you think? Karen asked. I think they still don't understand. Meaning, they're asking me to fix one problem. They should be asking how to prevent the next 10. She laughed. I suspected you'd say that. 2 hours later, my phone rang. This time it wasn't Horizon. It was someone I'd never expected to hear from. Mr. Carter? Speaking. My name is Michael Reynolds. The name sounded familiar. I'm chairman of Horizon Industrial's board of directors. That explained it. The board had bypassed executive management entirely. I appreciate you taking my call. What can I do for you? I'd prefer to discuss that in person. I agreed to meet him the following morning at a quiet cafe halfway between our homes. No corporate conference room. No lawyers. No human resources representatives reading prepared statements. Just a conversation. Michael Reynolds arrived exactly on time. He looked older than the photographs on the company's website. Tired, if I were being honest. We shook hands and ordered coffee. I'll be direct, he said. I appreciate that. He opened a folder but didn't immediately hand it to me. I've spent the last 4 days reviewing internal reports. And I discovered something that concerns me. What was that? You predicted nearly every issue we're experiencing. I tried. There are emails dating back 4 years. I know. Meeting minutes. Yes. Risk assessments. I wrote most of them. He nodded slowly. My mistake was assuming those reports were being acted upon. They weren't. No. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, he looked me in the eyes. I owe you an apology. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't emotional. It sounded genuine. You were dismissed because leadership believed your knowledge had already been transferred into new systems. It hadn't. We understand that now. I appreciated his honesty. Most executives spend enormous energy avoiding those 4 simple words. We were wrong. He finally slid the folder across the table. Inside was a proposal unlike the earlier ones. It wasn't employment. It wasn't temporary consulting. The board wanted Carter Operational Advisory to become Horizon's long-term strategic operations partner. Independent. Reporting directly to the board instead of executive management. Responsible for rebuilding compliance procedures, documenting operational knowledge, and mentoring the next generation of managers, so the company would never become dangerously dependent on a single individual again. The financial terms were generous. Far better than my previous salary. But that wasn't what caught my attention. The final page contained one sentence. Operational recommendations provided by Carter Operational Advisory shall not be altered or dismissed without formal board review. For the first time in my career, experience wasn't being treated as an obstacle to modernization. It was being recognized as its foundation. I closed the folder. I'll review everything with my attorney. Michael smiled. I was hoping you'd say that. As we stood to leave, He extended his hand again. Daniel. Yes. I think we spent too many years measuring employees by salary instead of value. I shook his hand. That mistake is more common than most companies realize. Karen and I spent the next 3 days reviewing every page of Horizon's proposal. The contract was thorough, but I had learned long ago that the most important details in any agreement usually appeared in the sections most people skipped. There were no hidden surprises. No clauses allowing the company to terminate the partnership without notice. No language limiting my ability to work with other clients. Most importantly, there was one provision I insisted on adding. Every major operational decision involving compliance, supplier risk, or emergency planning would require written documentation explaining why recommendations were accepted or rejected. If executives wanted to ignore professional advice in the future, they could. But there would always be a record. The board approved the revision without changing a single word. That told me everything I needed to know. They weren't looking for someone to blame anymore. They were looking for someone to help rebuild trust. Walking back into Horizon's headquarters felt different than I expected. 3 weeks earlier I had left carrying a cardboard box. Now I returned through the front entrance as an independent consultant. The security guard recognized me immediately. Good to see you again, Daniel. Good to be back. There was no awkward silence this time. No whispered conversations. People smiled. Some stopped to shake my hand. Others simply nodded with quiet respect. Word had spread quickly. The restructuring had officially ended. Several executives had resigned. Others had been reassigned after the board completed its internal review. Ryan Edwards was no longer with the company. I never learned exactly where he went, and honestly I never tried to find out. Holding on to resentment would have accomplished nothing. The first board meeting lasted nearly 6 hours. Instead of asking me to solve one immediate problem, they wanted to understand why the company had become so vulnerable in the first place. I began with a sentence that surprised some of them. The biggest mistake wasn't eliminating my position. Several directors looked confused. The biggest mistake, I continued, was believing one person's knowledge had already been replaced simply because software existed. I projected a diagram onto the screen. It wasn't complicated. 3 circles connected by arrows. Technology, processes, people. When these 3 support each other, I explained, companies become stronger. When one replaces the others, companies become fragile. For the next several hours we reviewed every operational weakness that had accumulated during the restructuring. Supplier relationships that depended on trust rather than contracts. Transportation routes that looked efficient on spreadsheets but failed during severe weather. Compliance procedures that required professional judgment instead of automated checklists. Emergency plans that hadn't been updated in years because everyone assumed nothing would go wrong. By the end of the meeting, nobody was talking about cutting costs. They were talking about reducing risk. That was a much healthier conversation. Over the following months, my small consulting business grew steadily. Not because I advertised aggressively. Not because I promised miracles. People simply talked. A supplier recommended me to another manufacturer. That company introduced me to one of its partners. Former colleagues called asking whether I could review their operational strategies before making major organizational changes. Every project reinforced the same lesson. Most business crises don't appear overnight. They develop slowly while warning signs are ignored. The companies willing to listen early almost never face catastrophic failures later. One afternoon Lisa stopped by my temporary office inside Horizon. She had recently been promoted to Director of Logistics. The promotion surprised no one who had worked with her. Competence eventually becomes difficult to overlook. She smiled as she placed a folder on my desk. You should see this. Inside were the latest federal audit results. Every section had passed without a single corrective action. No deficiencies. No compliance concerns. No outstanding recommendations. The highest score Horizon had received in over a decade. We couldn't have done it without you, she said. I shook my head. You absolutely could. She looked unconvinced. You just needed someone willing to teach instead of keeping everything inside one person's head. That became one of my priorities. Instead of becoming indispensable again, I built training programs. Every critical process was documented. Every major supplier relationship included detailed transition plans. Young managers rotated through different departments to understand how decisions in one area affected every other part of the business. Knowledge stopped belonging to individuals. It became part of the organization itself. Ironically, that made my own consulting work even more valuable. Companies didn't hire me because I possessed secrets. They hired me because I helped make sure they wouldn't depend on secrets anymore. Almost a year after my dismissal, I drove past Horizon on my way to another client meeting. The parking lot looked the same. The buildings hadn't changed. But the company inside was different. Employees were encouraged to question risky decisions. Managers documented concerns instead of remaining silent. Experience and innovation were no longer competing against each other. They worked together. My phone rang through the truck speakers. It was my youngest daughter. "Dad, Mom says you're working too much again." I laughed. "Does she? She also says you've postponed our fishing trip twice. Then I guess I owe both of you a weekend." Good answer. After hanging up, I realized something. For most of my career, success had meant being available every hour of every day. If my phone wasn't ringing, I assumed something was wrong. Now things were different. I chose the projects I wanted. I spent more evenings at home. I finally built the workshop behind the house that I had talked about for years but never had time to finish. Life had become quieter. Not because fewer problems existed, but because I no longer carried every problem alone. People sometimes ask whether I regret being laid off after 21 years. The honest answer surprises them. At the time, it felt like the worst day of my professional life. Looking back, it was the day everything finally changed. Losing my position forced me to discover that my experience wasn't tied to a job title or an office inside someone else's building. It belonged to me. Companies can eliminate departments. They can reorganize reporting structures. They can replace executives, rename divisions, and introduce new software every few years. But they cannot instantly replace years of judgment earned through solving real problems. Experience has value long before a crisis begins. The smartest organizations recognize that early. The rest usually learn it the expensive way. And sometimes the end of one career isn't really an ending at all. Sometimes it's simply the first day you finally begin building something that's truly your own.